balloons, bazookas, boobies, bosoms, boulders, cans, hooters, knockers, melons, honkers, jugs, rack, tatas, tits, torpedoes, guns, bust, doorknobs, coconuts, and our favorite one, the girls. Welcome to the All About Breastfeeding show, where your host, Lori, highlights mothers just like yourself and goes beyond the surface questions and digs deep so they share not only their joys and happiness in their daily breastfeeding life, but also their pain and struggles and how they worked through them.
Episode number 106. Welcome to All About Breastfeeding, the place where the girls hang out. I am your host, Lori Jill Eisenstadt, IBCLC. Last week, we ended by talking about Judith Waterford, a legendary breastfeeder who was written up in medical journals because she was what I would say a lifelong wet nurse who was still apparently going strong at 81 years of age. I can only imagine what eyebrows Judith would raise in the year 2016. In case you missed the first show of this series, you will want to go back and listen to show number 103. To quickly catch new listeners up to speed, we're talking about wet nurses, who are women who breastfeed another woman's child. This was a common practice before the introduction of bottle feeding and formula. It was so popular, and yet there were some problems with it as it moved toward becoming a paid profession. Yes, a paid profession. Along with this, it became a well-organized profession with contracts and laws designed to regulate its practice. There are records from ancient Babylonian that show rules and laws and payments and working conditions for wet nursing practices. It was a common way to feed babies all over the world for many, many years. We are going to talk about the practice of wet nursing, and while I'm going to begin with talking about European countries, you will notice that the information is not the same for each country, as breastfeeding habits varied from region to region. I will talk about wet nursing in Britain in the 18th century, and then maybe talk about in London around the same time. And the practices can be markedly different. People and their religions and their customs and personal finances, as well as living arrangements, were as different then as they are now. This means that all customs do not fit into the same box, and all wet nursing experiences and habits were not all the same for thousands of years. Just to give you a few examples to illustrate what I'm talking about, in modern times, we might find that moms who live in one region of the United States are more likely to breastfeed than those who live in other areas. You can check out the CDC's breastfeeding report card, and you can study the differences in breastfeeding rates from state to state. In the 1950s, the breastfeeding rates were in the 20%, and in the year 1984, it was closer to 35%. And in the year 2000, more than 70% of moms were breastfeeding. And in the year 2016, currently, more than 85% of moms initiate breastfeeding. That's a marked difference between actually a fairly relative short period of time between the 1950s and 2016. There definitely is a difference in cultures and socioeconomic and financial status. Black Americans tend to have much lower breastfeeding rates, as do Native American Indians and teenagers. Women who stay home from work longer, they tend to breastfeed more than moms who return to work by 8 weeks. I say this because as I go through and talk about different times and different cultures, it may be confusing to you in that you might have the strong desire to put women in a specific category. And just like modern women who choose to breastfeed and for how long and exclusive or mixed feedings, women of many years ago, they had varied reasons for making a wide variety of choices and sometimes different choices for the same baby. There were times when breastfeeding your own baby may have been all about breeding, as it was called years ago. A significant reason for wet nursing was that a noblewoman's main function was to produce heirs. A falsehood of history is the myth of the poor breeding like rabbits. Actually, it was the aristocrats that deserved this comparison. Unless we are living in reality TV land, the average woman is not having pregnancies that reach 12 and 15 and 18 pregnancies like they did in the 17th century. A majority of their babies sadly died, while only a few survived. Since the queens were in the business of bringing heirs into the family, they kept having babies to ensure they had sons that lived beyond childhood. It was the ordinary women who breastfed their own babies and wet nursed others. This protected them from the excessive fertility of noblewomen whose babies were wet nursed from birth. Evidence from 17th century rural England shows an awareness of the contraceptive effect of lactation. Countrywomen rarely had more than 7 children. Records show that their births were better spaced out than those of the rich, and their babies were more likely to survive. The poor were not breeding like rabbits, as long as they were caring for and breastfeeding the babies from wealthier families. Wet nurses were often highly valued, especially in large, wealthy households where they were usually regarded as one of the upper servants. They would stay with the family for years, and many lifelong bonds were formed between nurse and child. Wet nursing in France went through up and down periods. By the 18th century, mothers needed to work to bring home an income, as it was hard at that time to live on one income. Sound familiar? This created a unique problem in urban settings. Working mothers began to send their babies to the countryside to be cared for by women even poorer than themselves. As the demand increased, the cost of hiring wet nurses soared, while the quality of care plummeted. Upper middle class families began hiring wet nurses and bringing them into their home so they could closely supervise them to ensure that the babies were properly cared for. Poor working families could only afford the cheapest wet nurses, who lived far away. In my reading, I learned that the babies who lived far away from their mothers and taken care of by wet nurses who were paid low wages, well, those babies didn't fare so well, and probably because they were not cared for so well. The demand for this service led to high infant mortality. This led to wet nursing becoming more regulated during the second half of the 18th century. Now, this is where it becomes really interesting, and to me, seems to mimic modern-day business models. There were wet nurse bureaus, which were employment agencies for wet nurses. All of a sudden, there were 4 existing wet nurse bureaus who were now competing for business. The Parisian police authorities stepped in to combine them into a municipal bureau of wet nurses, which guaranteed wet nurses a minimum wage. The bureau assured parents an adequate supply of wet nurses, and it pursued nurses not to neglect their babies by advancing them their monthly salary. The bureau, and not the wet nurse, then collected the wet nurses' wages from infants' fathers. Sounding familiar? I'm a person who I tend to get turned off when hearing too many numbers and statistics in a row. My brain just doesn't function that way. I'm about to state some numbers and stats, and I encourage you, stick with me, as this information is so fascinating. You will want to hear it. One of the reasons I wanted to do this historical tour of breastfeeding is because, as humans, we tend to simplify breastfeeding. We tend to judge others for not doing what we feel is the best way to feed our babies. We tend to judge others who are working inside the home, outside the home, not currently at a paying job, and just staying home with our babies and children. There are tendencies to judge others how they feed their baby. Are they breastfeeding? Are they bottle feeding? Are they mixing breast and bottle? And yes, Modern moms are practicing the art of daily, wet and cross nursing, and there are judgments surrounding these practices also. The next piece of information really highlights the fact that breastfeeding has rarely been as straightforward as some people think it is or think it should be. It really has never been one mom, one baby, together forever. The Bureau of Wet Nurses was one of the few institutions to survive the French Revolution. Bureau records indicate that of the 66,259 nurslings placed between 1700 and 1776, 31% died while in wet nurses' care, a considerably lower rate of infant mortality than wet nursed infants had previously suffered. That is amazing statistics. In 6 years, there was 66,259 nurslings placed in the hands of wet nurses. Until its demise in 1876, which is 100 years later, the Bureau of Wet Nurses of the City of Paris provided an alternative both to the inferior service offered by private wet nurse bureaus and the expense of public charities caring for foundlings. With the passage of the Rousseau Law in 1874, the supervision of wet nursed infants became a national rather than a municipal responsibility. The Rousseau Law mandated that every infant placed with a paid guardian outside the parent's home be registered with the state. In this way, the French government was able to monitor how many children were placed with wet nurses, and the figure is an insanely amount, 80,000 a year between 1874 and World War I. And how many of these infants died, which is 15%. So what this tells us, when everything was being monitored closely, the infant mortality rate dropped in half. That's pretty incredible. The custom of wet nursing did not wane in France until, like I said, about World War I. The war's tumult disrupted access to wet nurses and demonstrated to urban families long reluctant to consider any alternative to maternal nursing other than wet nursing that safe, inexpensive, and easy artificial infant feeding options now existed. A decline in working mothers after World War I, passage of a law granting a monthly bonus of 15 francs to women who were working if they breastfed their babies for 12 months, and the routine pasteurization of milk and the availability of canned milk, all of this contributed to the virtual instantaneous extinction of wet nursing in France. The practice of wet nursing became less popular in the 19th century due in part to scares that diseases such as tuberculosis and syphilis could be transferred by breast milk. Better alternatives to mother's milk slowly became available, but children fed on these milks still had a much higher mortality rate than those who were breastfed. I look forward to sharing next Wednesday's show as we continue with our Tour of Breastfeeding series. I hope you're finding this interesting and fascinating, and we have much more to come. Before we say goodbye for the day, I would like to invite you to head on over to allaboutbreastfeeding.biz to get your free copy of My Best Tips for Pumping and Storing Milk. Until the next time, bye-bye.